All right, welcome back. This is going to be chapter 8. I know I said the last one was chapter 8, but it was actually chapter 7. I'm sorry for the faux pas. Yeah, this is going to be a review of chapter 8. So, the basic thesis that runs through chapter 8 is that while voting might be down since the 1980s, as we've discussed before, other forms of political participation are on the rise, right? These sort of um, non institutional forms of political participation, or what they call sort of unconventional politics. This includes things like protests and signing petitions and rioting, even participating in rallies and sit ins and marches and boycotts, especially. So again, while voting has been down about 10 to 12 points since the 1980s across the world, this sort of unconventional political action has been on the rise recently, uh, especially since the 1990s. So we saw two shifts really. There was a new focus. Um, there was a guy named Putnam, Robert Putnam from Harvard University, who wrote a book about civil society, and I think it was called Bowling Alone, and it was sort of about how civil society was on a slow decline, um, and that this lack of a sort of Tocquevillian association, the degradation of these sort of groups like bowling leagues where you go and meet others in your society, and you discuss things like politics and morals and religion and blah, blah, blah. That this was leading to sort of a dearth in the democratic context, and it was even sort of degrading democracy itself. So it's a really, really famous book. Again, his name is Robert Putnam, but this brought a whole new light on sort of civil societies, and so we see a lot of research on civil societies. My dissertation actually was partly about civil societies and political trust between sort of minority and majority ethnic groups. So I really like this stuff. But in the 90s, again, there was this new focus on civil societies. Um, Political scientists and politicians were starting to notice that there were all these new, and some of them aren't new, right? We saw some of this stuff in like the civil rights marches and acts, where Martin Luther King and others, like Malcolm X, were actually using things like violence as political means. But Martin Luther King, especially, was using sort of nonviolence, on par with sort of the philosophies of Mahatma Gandhi, and some of the philosophies of Christ in the Bible. That's where he sort of based his own personal philosophies. And Martin Luther King would use things like sit-ins and protests and boycotts of the Montgomery bus system, and things of that sort to make a political point rather than voting, because of voting was difficult for black people in the South. There were a lot of Jim Crow laws. There was violence. There were lynchings. There were horrible things happening to black people in the South. And so we did see some of these unconventional politics earlier in American history, but they really started to rise sort of post Reagan, post Margaret Thatcher, during the 1990s. And another sort of shift was the shift towards boycotting. People started to realize that their monetary expenditures for their household, or for just like expendable goods, they had a little bit of power in deciding sort of what happened in, say, food products, right? This is where this big industry of like dolphin safe tuna comes from. People were really furious that a lot of dolphins were dying during tuna capture, to put tuna cans, in the markets. And so they started boycotting companies that didn't use nets that would allow the dolphins to get free, right? And so we've seen a precipitous decline in the number of dolphin deaths because of this sort of boycotting effort. And so that's just one example, but a lot of boycotting came around in the '90s, and you also the final thing really is like the advent of the internet in the 1990s. It was this new tool that allowed for instant communication, mass mobilization of sort of people that are into your, say, political idea, but you didn't really know how to contact them before. There's new ways of contacting people, and new ways of disseminating information about economics and about how private businesses are run and how they treat their employees and how politicians are behaving and sort of what they're doing in their bills, all of these things. So it became easier to disseminate information across the population, and especially those who are sort of members of your political group, right? So we saw that all these huge shifts, while we have also seen sort of a decline in voter turnout, right? So it inevitably leads to the question of why, right? And I think the most famous answer, and one they spend a little bit of time here on in the book, is Ronald Inglehart's Silent Revolution. Ronald Inglehart suggests that sort of post World War II, you had new changes in society, right? You had lots of riches across Europe and America. Um, so people were sort of much richer than they were prior to World War II. There was a lot less inequality. Unions were starting to become more powerful and giving sort of voice to workers, which was increasing incomes. Um, there was also the idea that there was mass mobilization during World War II, and so it was harder for politicians to say you don't deserve a piece of the pie when they came back home, right? And so you saw this incredible shift in inequality, shifting towards greater equality across these societies. So a lot more people were able to sort of provide for their family beyond a subsistence level. And at the same time, you get this sort of lack of social turmoil. There's very few wars going on in the world. There is the Cold War, of course, and sort of Korea and Vietnam and those things. But Europe and America are largely very peaceful during this time, right? There's a huge period of time in which there really are no wars breaking out across the continent like there were before World War II. And so the combination of these two things leads the new generations who are being born to sort of shift their thinking on Maslow's hierarchy, right? I don't know if you've ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy. It's this triangle where at the very bottom you have to have the things that you need to survive: food, water, shelter, right? And the further you get up the triangle toward the peak, you get to sort of artistic expression and self-expression and finding yourself, all of these sort of things that modern society individuals tend to want to find rather than just providing for their family and working 80 hours a week, that sort of thing. And so you get this shift up Maslow's hierarchy towards this self-expression peak, right? And this brings all kinds of challenges to society. The younger cohorts start to challenge religion, right? We've seen religion sort of decline precipitously in America and across Europe. Americans are far more religious, and literally biblical than Europeans are, right? Europeans tend to take it as more of sort of a metaphor. Christians tend to take it, in America, at least sort of the Protestant strand, start to take it very literally, the biblical interpretations. So those are two sort of differences across the channel there. But you start to see these challenges to religion. Religion starts to dwindle. Participation starts to dwindle. Church service goers start to dwindle. The Anglican Church in Europe is not really taken too seriously. And so you get a challenge to religion. You get a challenge to sort of work motivations. We're really seeing that now post-COVID, where people are really challenging the old institutions of work, right? They want to work at home. They want sort of better respect. They want better retirement benefits, these things. And so sort of the work environment is changing. You see changes in the goals of parents, right? They have different goals for their children, different goals for themselves. Women are more in the workplace. You also have the questioning of whether we're going to have children or not, right? The replacement levels are not being met in most of these European democracies and in America. And so really the only reason they can keep their population stable is through immigration. And so that's a major shift in Europe, in sort of the developed world, is the number of kids being had, right? It went from an average of like 4.5 to 6 to now we're down to like 1.8 or something per family, right? And so that's another attitude that's changing, especially attitudes toward LGBTQ, and sort of divorce was a really big topic in, say, Ireland and Britain, with the Catholic Church in Ireland really taking a hard stance against divorce, but they eventually changed the constitution, allowed divorce. So those are some attitudes that change. You can definitely see changes in attitudes towards homosexuals and LGBTQ members. You've also seen the rise of green parties, right? Environmental concerns have become a big shift in politics. Most people have a higher education on average than they did in, say, the 1940s and 50s. And so this massive combination of changes in the younger cohorts of society has led, arguably, to this exit from institutional politics of voting, right? So why do we see less voting and more sort of alternative or unconventional politics? Inglehart says it's because of the shift towards post-materialism, and that the challenging of all the norms of society has led people to sort of exit the voting realm, the institutional idea that I get to choose my representative, and more shifted towards these alternative modes of participation, which give you an actual voice, that can let you sort of hone in on a specific policy rather than on just a political party's platform. And so, again, this is the most sort of researched paradigm for this shift of the decline of voting, but the rise in political participation in other realms. So that's chapter 8 for you. This was a little bit of a longer one, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you for the next one. Have a great day.